All right, everybody, welcome to a really special event. This is the New Civilization Project, a club based out of Boise State University, and the title of our event, as scheduled, is
Jordan Peterson has no future.
Jordan Peterson has no future, and we are being joined today by the author of Four Futures, Peter Frase. We read this book last year, and so a repeat for a refresher for a lot of people, and it's really exciting to come back to it. Kenneth, who's actually off camera right now, is the gent who the instigator. He showed up to NSP organized a meeting to for anyone who would be interested in starting a local chapter of the DSA. Not last spring, right?
It was a year ago.
A year ago. It's been a while. And Kenneth came on in and he was holding a copy of Four Futures, and every time I talked to him that night, he was talking about Four Futures, and so I got it on Audible and I listened to it, and I thought, wow, this is one of the most essential readings for all campus reads. And so, yeah, what we're doing today is a little different than normal in a couple of ways. One, because being joined by the author, we're actually going to spend some time unpacking the text and then be joined by Peter, and then there'd be a presentation. But he wanted to be able to join for this, and so welcome. He's here. He said that he'll be leaving himself muted, though, just for the first portion of this while we're going through our unpacking. And then Athen is on camera today, and we've got a couple other cameras and a fancy mic and all this stuff. And we've never done this before, but we're going to start trying to produce higher quality content for the YouTube, because it's pretty important in this day and age to make critical theory and ideas that come out of it more accessible to the general public. And so it's really exciting. Cool. So Four Futures, talk about it. who wants to say something about it?
Well, I would say it's one of the most trenchant and elegant books I've ever come across. It's very schematic and very resonant for all of that. Simple idea, and it folds out beautifully.
Absolutely. I'm actually working on a presentation, 20-minute presentation, and I'm going to basically be pulling off of Four Futures for that presentation. It's going to be to like 100 students this week. It's pretty exciting. It ties in really well with the New Civilization Project, right? Because the New Civilization Project is about trying to think of and practice ways of being that are not capitalist, realist, or reactionary. And I think Four Futures is the schema that it lays out is a really useful tool for breaking people out of capitalist realism. Essentially, it just takes three variables. One's a constant, and two aren't, and it uses these to think about the future. We take how does this go? We take automation, and we assume that is our constant variable. That automation is going to continue as it has been for the last couple of hundred years. Things will become more and more refined, more and more productive, more and more efficient. And then the question becomes, okay, well, given that, what about inequality and ecological scarcity versus abundance? So someone else say some stuff about it. I don't know. It's weird. But I'm used to talking with cameras on, but I'm not used to talking with like 3 cameras on. So yeah, adds some pressure. So.
Well, I'm reminded of an old William Gibson line of the dystopia is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And here we're given 2 or 4 different versions of a dystopia. And And, this is one of the great tropes of science fiction. You just take a current trend and you just extend it a bit logically and sometimes absurdly, but absurd things do happen. But I like the grid that this guy lays out, and it is a good tool for you to think about it.
You want to talk about more or describe that grid?
I assume you're talking about this grid, talking about like which what each of the four futures falls under, whereas communism is a future of abundance and equality, socialism is a future of scarcity and equality, rentism, abundance and hierarchy, and externalism is scarcity and hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess
Exterminism.
Oh, did I write it wrong?
Yeah, it's worse.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's one of the bad ones.
Yeah. So it's just interesting how all of these it's just interesting how they could all happen, and they're all like realistic, I feel like. And so it just kind of depends on what happens with our political struggle in the future and where it takes us. And obviously some of these are ideal and some of these are really good futures.
Yeah, pure test cases, like a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Well, and you said political struggle too, which is the author's main point, I think, is that the techno-futurist types who tend to write about automation tend to leave out labor struggle, right?
Yeah.
They also tend to be the type of techno-futurists who think that capitalism has magically given like the 40-hour work week, right? Like that these things did not come by struggle and that they couldn't be easily, taken away, given some negligence or apathy on our part. And so the real point is that it's like without struggle, renterism or exterminism are almost guaranteed. Therefore, without the struggle, without the push, we're not going to have that better distribution of resources, given that more highly automated future.
Yeah, like maybe we will not have a capitalist society anymore, but there will still be these hierarchies that make society unfair to some people.
Anything you like about it? Well,
it's totally off topic, but the main thing that I loved was the Star Trek comparison. So I was like, I don't know, reading philosophy is hard, and that was the first time I realized that like you can compare. Like I very much understand the Star Trek metaphor. It made it pretty clear for me. I can talk about it, I think, but I don't know if I'll remember it very well.
Yeah, Star Trek out of all those futures is kind of between communism and socialism, right? Because there's not really scarcity, right? There's not a whole lot of scarcity. So
it's an abundance economy.
Yeah, they have I don't know what they're called, but like the reproducer thing, where you just, he talks a lot about
the replicator.
Yeah, the replicator. He talks a lot about that in one of them. Yeah, just the idea that we won't necessarily need workers and laborers in like a Star Trek society if something could just be produced like with the press of a button or with.
Well, 2 points. We're taking baby steps towards that with the advent of 3D printing. And secondly, so far as automation goes, I mean, I work at the state liquor warehouse, and robots do not pick the product. We do. Human beings do. But that could change virtually overnight. But as it is, a machine cannot count how many cases of liquor are on a pallet.
Right.
Well, I think it's interesting what he talks about, like what the machines can and can't do, and he, like, especially in the communism section, I found that one really interesting. He essentially says, well, robots can take over the most like nurturing and caring jobs, like being a nurse or working in a retirement home. And so, like, really, I feel like in that one he's saying, yeah, the automation could take over so much as that, the things that we consider to be like the most human jobs, and especially he says the jobs that we consider to be more feminine in that, like the woman normally does the nurse, like the nurse was one of those.
Yeah, this has already been happening in Japan for I think more than a decade now, because they have an aging population who takes care of these geriatric people.
I think the thing that I find most compelling about this way of thinking about things is that refugee crises are already a really big deal. There's more people uprooted and forced on the move now than at any other time in history, and those numbers are rising, and those numbers are caused by capitalist empire overseas, how it manages its political, how it manages its foreign affairs, and then climate change as well. There are already climate refugees, right? And if that's going to get worse, and we can expect that it will, with 1 billion people relying on the Himalayas snowpack alone, right? The Himalaya Ganges. That's 1 billion people who rely on water from one snowpack that is literally diminishing. It's not replenishing like it's supposed to. It's completely unprecedented. We're headed for a future where more and more and more people are going to be on the move, and where resources are going to be more scarce, like water, for instance, or the kinds of food that need water. Well, like all food needs water. So it's not just scarcity; it's also precarious and marginalized populations. And that's one of like Judith Butler's big points in Notes Towards a Theory of Assembly or whatever, which I've been reading here and there. And the language she uses is that in society, in any society that we see right now, precarity itself is distributed very unequally. Precarity meaning the likelihood that you will die prematurely, or the likelihood that you will be assaulted, the likelihood that you will end up in a hospital, and that will literally bankrupt you.
This is Maslow's pyramid stuff.
Yeah, base human needs.
Yes,
base human needs. The base bare necessities anyone would need to have even a good life, but I mean really any life at all. And so in the US it's like mommy capitalists versus like daddy capitalists. That's like the liberal versus conservative thing in the US. And the narrative is like how much government intervention. But the thing is that capitalism itself is inherently like maintained. That inequality, that distribution of precarity is maintained through the police and the military, right? And so and that's why like half our taxes go to the police and the military. So I appreciate this for having given me a way of thinking about how automation plays a role in creating a larger and larger superfluous population.
Yeah, well, it talked about, stepping back a couple steps, it talked about when the replicator is created, it could very easily lead to the rentism future. Or with I don't know if he covered the hardship it would take to get to the communist future, the ideal Star Trek future. Because like in Star Trek, they only got there because of this huge world-destroying war. And you were talking about earlier how we're gonna have to work to get to, because we can't fight automation. We're gonna have to work to get to a good future for people to live in, because otherwise you'll get back to the rentism future where there aren't any jobs, but you still need money to make things. I don't really remember where I was going with that, so that's the end of my thought.
Not only in the rentism future do you need money to have the products, but you need money because that whole talks about like intellectual property and how like, people are gonna, you know, try to violate it, and there's gonna be lawsuits and all this. And so you not only need money for like purchasing these things and like requesting like whatever intellectual property or whatever you want to reproduce, but you need lawyers, you need like to pay for the guards of this society. So yeah, it's interesting in some of these. It's like how are people getting their money? What is happening to everyone else who's not, like, for example, in the Rentism future, a creator, a lawyer, a marketer, or a guard, which is what he says essentially will be like the positions in the future.
Intellectual property is odd. And the monopoly of force.
Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of science fiction films. Rollerball is one in which the corporations basically run everything.
Cool.
Same thing with the Alien franchise, the big bad corporation.
Also, I love the part when it says that these people who feel so when he says men don't want to be actually be useful, they merely want to feel useful. There's a lot of that in our society right now, and people really want to hold on to jobs. And obviously, like, politicians have made job creation and, you know, job growth and stability like the number one thing. But it's like, wait, why? Why are we doing that? Oh yeah, because under capitalism, you are only legitimate and you only have value insofar as you're able to grow capital.
Yeah.
And so people want to feel useful, but the thing is like, look, it's like having a friend who's like trying to do that thing for you where it's like, look, I'd love you to help me with something I need help with, but you're trying to help me with something I literally don't need any help with. And we have a lot of people like that right now. And like we saw some of those people, you know, they wanted to bring coal back, you know, in 2016. It's like, yeah, we'd love you to be useful, but like this is not.
No, stop it.
Not happening.
I feel like society has bred a culture of people feeling like they need to be a worker or they're nothing. And so he highlights how, like, the difference between unemployed people versus, like, people who have retired. So they're, like, out of this expected working class, whereas the people who are, like, prime working age, prime working conditions, who don't have a job, they feel useless. They feel like they're not what they're supposed to be in this society, which is a worker.
Right, which is usually people's response to the idea that we could have a society, a post-work society, where we've either divided the work enough to make it so that we don't have a lot, or we basically abolish it for most people, except for the people who want it. And like the response is often, oh, but people would be so depressed. And the response, I think in here, right, was that the depressed unemployed person is really depressed because, like, what, they're lacking the social connections because everyone's busy all the time, and the fact that they're not seen as really contributing or having any value in the society. So,
and in our culture, it is taken often enough to be a moral failure, a character flaw, a moral failure on the part of someone. I mean, this is the Horatio Alger society. You work hard enough, you have social upwards mobility.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a job, then you're a born loser. And there's a considerable intellectual history in this country of people who are not successful. You know, if you don't have a job, then suddenly does your social capital go up or down? Well, you're available all the time to hang out, but that's not a scarce resource anymore.
Right. Is there anything else that we should touch on before wrapping this down?
I don't think we hit on exterminism.
Yes. In fact, we didn't really define how any of these four futures really.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how in depth we were going.
So communism, socialism,
Rentism.
rentism.
And an extremism.
Yeah, how would you describe those? I know, I mean, communism, abundance, and
Yeah.
equality, right? Like,
Yeah, and he talks about in the communist society, people would just like work because they wanted to, and work wouldn't really be work anymore. So that would take up people's like leisure time. Work would become leisure, and so they kind of like intermingle in that society.
multi-professional, and they're studying philosophy because they. So I would have a place in society.
And there'd be more shows like The Good Place.
Yeah, yeah. More good shows too. Less made just to capital. Transformers, you know. Yeah. So then socialism though is like a little bit less. It's interesting because the way that the word being used here are different than how people use them colloquially. So communism really just means this is what would naturally come about if we were dividing things up pretty equally and we had an abundance of resources and commodities. Right, whereas socialism assumes instead scarcity, and it's instead saying like, look, we can all hold together though, we can all still, you know, make this not completely terrible, especially for the most, you know, redistributing things pretty well, like not just redistributing money, but like access to goods and services, etc. Rentism is a lot how things are becoming now to your life, like
But you own them.
Adobe and
Own
Netflix
them.
and Audible and all of these things that I'm hooked into. I don't own them, and I'm not gaining. If I stop paying, I would lose access to all of them tomorrow. Well, after my subscriptions are up, I guess. Rentism's pretty. I mean, yeah, it's like that already. With, I mean, people are moving into renting, actually using cars, or you know, using Uber or whatever instead of ride shares. Yeah. Obviously, we're all renters and not homeowners.
I am a homeowner.
Okay. Okay. There's one instance. Okay. But exterminism, though, is just what happens whenever there's a lot of inequality and a lot of scarcity. The fascist rhetoric always picks up a notch, and some populist always comes along to say, oh, well, it must be group X, Y, or Z, or and Z that is doing this, that's creating this. You know, not real people. In fact, they're probably causing the problem. It's the damn Jews. It's the postmodern feminist neo-Marxists. You know, speaking of Jordan Peterson, they're the ones causing all the chaos. We need to institute our white male order that has nothing to do with whiteness or male. Yeah. Exterminism.
Did we talk about rentism?
For a second, that was why I said those subscriptions, but yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have some thoughts on renters?
No.
I don't know. Sufficient job, like explaining what's going on.
Yeah, I think I got it down pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Can't imagine it's scatters. So.
Well, I think that simplifying it down into the grid that you first brought up was definitely really helpful because it's visual, and it's also just categorize everything into 2 of 4 different categories, which is really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, these are based off, he says that these are like ID lines or something. That was inspired by a sociologist. Was it Weber? I'm not sure.
There was a similar typology in a 1990 article by Robert Costanza. I don't know if that's the one you're referencing, but that one talks about the 4 scenarios. They're pretty much the 4 futures.
Gotcha. Yeah, I also really liked talking about like the worst kind of like there's this shabby sci-fi because it's too general, and there's like this terrible sociology because it's like way too specific about what things will come, right? And Ray Kurzweil, or however you say the name, from Google, who predicted how everything will be in 1942 or whatever. How that was a sort of sociology of the future that was way too specific in its predictions. And I think that this definitely does a good job of kind of balancing sci-fi and sociology and not making either of those errors, being too general in the sci-fi and not being too specific in the sociology.
And it's interesting to me in each one there's either an emphasis on the automation or the climate, and like some of them he talks about both, but like for example in the communist society, it's really focusing on what we do with the automation and what will happen after that, whereas in socialism it's paying more attention to, okay, so yeah, maybe we aren't required to work all the time, but in like how are we going to handle the climate crisis as a communist? We behind, we don't have to worry about it. Again, it goes back to the grid of like in that world, it's diversity, and so it's really interesting comments he makes on that, because right now we see a lot of people saying we have to pull back, we have to stop, whereas he is saying we have to get more involved in it and create a better relationship with the environment instead of just like stop everything. Like we're already in this deep, so
yeah.
And it's just a matter of egalitarian society where we're all working together to do it.
We're all living in a prosthetic reality, in a very artificial reality. In 1909, E.M. Forster of Passage to India wrote a science fiction story, The Machine Stops. And what happens when your technological society fails? And this is actually a very likely scenario now, given hacking and vulnerable traffic systems and water systems and so on. I mean, you can't open up the paper without reading about yet another massive data breach. And there goes your credit history. So the machine, the prosthetic reality, is starting to shudder a little bit. So if not the machine that runs of itself, we have to be hands-on and get under the hood. But how we deal with climate change, that's the problem from hell. Because, it's like diabetes, it affects everything else and makes everything else worse.
Now, a lot of positive feedback's involved with that.
I mean, it blows my mind that denial of climate change is a thing. Ask the insurance industry. Ask the Department of Defense. They know that there are going to be wars fought over water.
I mean, even Idaho Power is on board now.
Yeah.
And shutting down their coal plants and all this. But I mean, it's not really that big of a surprise because people are, largely products of their media ecology, and the media ecology is shaped currently by over 200 think tanks funded by billionaires who have a vested interest in this issue being a lot more confusing than it is. Right, and that was I mean, Fraser brings that up in the book, actually, right? It's that the denialism. It's what it really shows us is what lengths various entities are willing to go to maintain their hegemony and their monopoly.
Deliberate obfuscation, the delivery of bread and circuses, and we're back with the Roman Empire. I mean, Iggy Pop wrote a classical work of scholarship, We Are the Children of Caesar. And all the fundamentals of our system were present in the Roman Empire. We are the children of Caesar.
All the fundamentals?
Yeah, mostly.
Like the internet?
Most of them. Most of
and
them.
climate change? Okay.
Most of them. Not all, most of them. But it's a good read. It's a good read. So, this is a problem that, we have faced before. I mean, empires have collapsed before. But empires have had the militaries overextended.
They never
Before.
just collapse. First, everyone gets real gay, and there's a lot of jubilees, meaning the mass forgiveness of debts. And so we have a lot of fun times ahead as well. And that's a conservative line. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's really true.
degenerate and all the rest.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, so let's close this out. 3 minutes. Say some things. Last thoughts.
I think overall one of my favorite parts of the whole book was the way he talked, what he said about, especially in the communism section, about the future of the automation and the robots, and how it was talking about how they can like potentially replace sentient beings in some of those jobs. And so I just think it'll be interesting how we handle that. I wrote a book last year called "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep" by Philip Dick, and reading this part where he's saying the robots take over the nurse's jobs really made me think about that, and how we will deal with like that type of automation and the artificial intelligence. And so I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting how that plays itself out in this future, whereas it's like kind of made it seem like it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So yeah, it just depends on what we do with the automation.
Well, I found Philip K. Dick to be eerily prescient in many aspects. I mean, even global warming, what makes human? Well, it's kindness. But there's some machines that are more kind than people.
Yeah.
Well, I can say one thing. You were talking about the issue of climate change denial. I think that a lot of that is an issue of just bad ways of going about thinking, like just bad methods of thought. And the corporations and groups like that are very happy to feed into that. They're very happy to confuse the issue. It makes,
Yeah, and with I'm sorry
go
to interrupt, but with the denialism, he kind of talks about how it's not even like blatantly saying it just doesn't exist. It's, oh, well, I'm fine, so why should I? Like these big corporations, they have the money, they will be okay if the world suddenly ends and everything's going to hell with like the climate
But they'll have their
change.
enclaves.
Yeah, so that's kind of what the like extremism future is a result of. That continued mindset of I'm okay. Oh look, the end is here. We're gonna go to outer space with our money. You guys figure it out.
And I think that even with small things like this group or books like this, we can. It has a bigger impact than I think we often think it does, because it helps people to think. That's a good thing.
Yeah. Think about the world and think about other things rather than that self-interest and the desire for money.
Which is actually the only thing that matters, according to Jordan Peterson, besides finding meaning in mysticism. So, yeah, literally, if you could just find your meaning in your mysticism, you could lean into capitalist realism, get with the system bucko, and everything will take care of itself as long as you work real hard. And but of course, you got to make sure you blame women and Marxists and postmodernists, who are all kind of the same thing anyway, because they're all just chaos, right? And mainly that scapegoating, essentializing discourse regarding postmodern feminist neo-Marxists is what we are responding to responding to Jordan Peterson in lieu of a debate conference coming up here in 10 days, which
12
is
days.
12 days. Okay, yes. And so this is actually, now we're actually making our transition here into the talk from Peter Frase. This is technically a pregame session as well. So we've already hosted one pregame session. That was with Antonio Garcia from the Zijikian Institute for Researching Pedagogy, and with Jaden Adams from the New Center for Research and Practice. And they both gave presentations on Jordan Peterson, and now we'll be being joined by Peter Frase. But before that, I also want to make a couple of announcements, and that is that this Tuesday, we will have another event. We're going to be joined by a couple of people who aren't able to make it to the conference, who will be giving their presentations, same style. And then I think that we'll be doing the same thing the following Tuesday. And then we'll get to all of our, craziness with the conference. And we're going to need all hands on deck. If anyone's able to volunteer, it's going to mean the world. We need people tabling. We need people chairing sessions. We need people shooting live broadcasts, and helping Athen with cameras and mics, because really this whole thing it's supposed to be so much more than just a conference. It's supposed to be bridging the academy with the public. Part of the sort of ethos or spirit of the conference is that, or one of the big drivers of it is that the academia tends to, and leftists who are often couched in academia, tend to really lose touch with speaking to the broader public, and that this is something that we really have to bridge. To say that Ayn Rand or Jordan Peterson is just a bad writer or a hack or whatever you want to say, oh, they're racist or something, is not enough. That if you actually care about making change at the cultural level, you have to learn how to talk to people, which is one of the reasons we're a big fan of this book, as well as the books put out by Zero Books, as well as like the magazine Current Affairs, or the channels for Peter Coffin or ContraPoints, is that they're all really developing this discourse with the public, and taking key insights from the last couple hundred years of political and social theory and critical theory, and disseminating those a lot more widely. So someone who's done a fantastic job of that, obviously, is Peter Frase, the author of Four Futures, who is also an editor at Jacobin, and he has a PhD in sociology from CUNY Graduate Center. So I hope he's here and he's ready to take it off. But please welcome Peter Frase.
Hello, everyone.
Okay.
All right. So
Hey,
just
can
gonna
you
go
hear us?
straight.
We can't hear you. Hold on one second.
Okay.
We had to turn our speaker back on here. All right. Does this work?
Yeah. All right. Can you hear me?
No, it doesn't work. Hold on. It might just take a second.
Okay.
Oh, we heard you now. Okay, good.
Got it. You hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Good.
Perfect.
And I know while you guys were talking, thanks for letting me listen in. By the way, it's always nice to. You guys obviously had a pretty good handle on what I was doing with the book, and it's always helpful for me to hear people, sort of how people receive it, so I have a sense as a writer of how what I'm doing works. So thanks. That was cool. And I apologize in advance if there's any dog barking in the background, so I'm recording this from my study at home. So I guess we're just going to get right into this. So I have a few slides that I'm going to show in this talk, which I have given a slightly different title than the one that was advertised, because just in the course of writing it, I sort of went in a direction that also is in keeping with the theme of no future for Jordan Peterson, but all in a slightly different way, But I'm going to talk on the sort of assumption that people haven't necessarily all read Four Futures, aren't all totally familiar with the argument. I'll go through sort of what that is, and then sort of try to relate that to the specific topic of Jordan Peterson and, more his recent sort of, self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, and the kind of phenomenon around that. I'm by no means a Jordan Peterson scholar or expert, nor have I waded through all 500 pages of maps of meaning. I'm more interested really in considering what it is that people find appealing about him, what it is about our current moment that is appealing, about him and sort of what we might offer as sort of an alternative or as a response. So, you know, my book, For Futures, was an attempt to sketch out possible alternatives outside of capitalism, beginning with this sort of with this premise that the kind of the fear or hope that is expressed often these days about rapid automation of production comes to pass one way or another. And of course, there are all sorts of reasons why things aren't really that simple. Not everything is susceptible right now, at least, to automation. It's also not just a technological problem, but a political one, because the incentive in a capitalist society to apply technology in a way that makes it possible to make more stuff with less human labor is really sort of partly depends on the strength and the power and the cost of human labor itself. So if it's cheap and easy to use workers instead of machines, then that's what tends to happen. And I would argue does tend to happen a lot of times in our society. But what I wanted to ask and what I wanted to try to figure out was, you know, what the possibilities were. And where this all started for me was in thinking about Star Trek. And it's why I ended up with a book that's sort of a work of social science and sort of a work of science fiction. So years ago, I wrote a blog post where I was just sort of doing this little thought experiment about Star Trek and pointing out that, in fact, the world of Star Trek, at least sometimes, is portrayed as basically a communist society. That's communist not in the sense of the Soviet Union, but communist in the sort of older Marxist or 19th century sense of a society without class, without private property, where everybody just sort of shares alike in sort of post-scarcity abundance, which, you know, the condition of possibility for that in the universe of Star Trek is that they have these devices called replicators, which allow you to just sort of press a button and make whatever you want. Nobody has to make it for you, or you don't have to make it yourself. And then also unlimited clean energy based on, you know, some made up antimatter form of energy that powers everything. So that they don't have to worry about, you know, where their energy is coming from and whether it's dirty or so on. Now, this isn't always consistently the way the Star Trek universe is portrayed, because, you know, it was many different shows written by many different people over a long period of time. It was never very rigorous or consistent in its world building, but that allows me to take sort of the version of Star Trek that's most politically useful to me. And so I did a thought experiment where I said, well, you know, the thing about Star Trek is it sort of assumes that you're going to just get this society if you have these technological preconditions eventually. Although in some of the canon, it's said that there was a period of wars and, you know, class inequality that sort of led up to this creation of this post-scarcity Star Trek society. But for the most part, it didn't talk a lot about the political struggles and the class struggles involved in moving from a society like ours based on inequality and hierarchy and private property into one where nobody has to work and everybody shares equally in, you know, the newfound prosperity. And what I sort of asked was, well, then what would happen if you had the same technology, but the capitalist class stayed in control, but didn't really need the workers that much anymore? How would they remain a ruling class when, in theory, everyone could just have a replicator that made whatever they needed? And the answer turned out to hinge on intellectual property. So that in the Star Trek universe, when Captain Picard of the Star Trek Enterprise on Star Trek The Next Generation wants his cup of hot Earl Grey tea, which is his favorite beverage, he just watches the replicator and says, "Tea, Earl Grey, hot," and it materializes out of thin air. Whereas in the what I originally called the anti-Star Trek universe, the rights to that pattern to create Earl Grey tea, like the patterns to everything else you might want, are owned by somebody in the same way that somebody can have a copyright on a book or a piece of music, the same way that companies today have patents on, you know, having the right to make certain medicines. Everything, in theory, could be organized that way, and so the replicator becomes something that's still enmeshed in all these private property relations, and an artificial scarcity is imposed upon it. So from there, you know, through some discussions with comrades, someone pointed out to me, well, this is a very interesting thought experiment, but what about the ecological dimension, particularly climate change, but also resource scarcity more generally? If you know, you may have the preconditions of the Star Trek world in terms of removing human labor from the equation, but what about the limits that are just placed on us by possible scarcities of raw materials, scarcities of habitable environments, so on and so forth? And so what this naturally suggested to me, as I was trained as a sociologist, and sociologists love their little 2x2 diagrams, was that I could simply take these two parameters, one being is this a hierarchical society, or is it, you know, an egalitarian society? And one and the other being, is this sort of an ecologically abundant world in the sense that we've managed to clean up the effects of climate change and reconstruct our energy systems and move to some, you know, viable sort of interchange with nature that is not as destructive as one we have now? Or there's some really tight material limits that have to be figured out, and do we have to figure out basically who gets how much of whatever limited stuff there is to go around, just in terms of material wealth? So let me go back to my little slideshow, which hopefully you guys can see. And I stole this. It's so nice that since the book came out, lots of people have read it and sort of made their own versions of this diagram, which appears in the book, but that, you know, made their own cooler looking versions of it. So you have, this is this diagram I set up in the book for what I call 4, you know, kind of hypothetical futures, which are based on elaborations of trends of things that are happening right now, which I kind of empirically talk about, but also using examples from science fiction, speculative fiction, to kind of give kind of vignettes or case studies, sort of, as if you will, of these sort of possible alternate universes and what they might kind of be like. And so you have here this one axis running from top to bottom that's called the equality, and this version is called the equality or class power axis. And so that in the top you have the more equal societies, where whatever scarcity abundance there is shared out relatively equally. And then on the bottom you have the hierarchically stratified societies like that are basically where things stay the way they are now or get worse, where there's a small ruling class controlling everything by means of private property relations, and then there's a large either working class or surplus class. And then on the other axis you have this question of the scarcity or abundance, or the level of ecological devastation in this case, which gives to you this question of have we really moved to that, you know, solar powered world and sucked all the carbon out of the atmosphere so we get temperatures back down again and the ice caps don't melt and so on and so forth, versus the world where a lot of hard choices have to be made about relocating people, about cleaning up damage from, you know, increasingly powerful hurricanes, all that kind of stuff, and where there's just not enough for everybody to replicate whatever they want. There has to be some kind of rationing in a sense. And, you know, observing that rationing, although the right associates it with socialism or communism, capitalism rations too. It just has a different mechanism of rationing, which is that the people that have the power and the money get what they want, and everybody else has to wait in line. So the book, I'll just sort of quickly go through what these 4 boxes sort of look like when you try to fill them in. Starting with the communism one, which is sort of, to me, the most, you know, is the most utopian and the most desirable of them, because it is sort of the Star Trek world. And I talk a little bit about Star Trek, but also about some other works that happen in kind of post-scarcity futures. One big one is Cory Doctorow's book, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is about what happens in this post-scarcity world where people basically, Disneyland has been expropriated and everybody who feels like it comes together to run it. And a lot of the point of this chapter ends up being about how communism is not a world with no problems or no conflict. It's not even a world with no hierarchies exactly. It's just one without that one big master class hierarchy of money that binds everyone together and creates sort of a single standard of what makes you important or what gives you status. There's all kinds of little status hierarchies. Like the people that run Disneyland have a status hierarchy. It's just that, you know, if you're not into that one, you can opt out of it and go do something else, because again, everyone's provided for. And in that book, in fact, even death is not a limit, because people can have their bodies like regenerated when they die and things like that. So the main point of that and the sort of political thing that I wanted to do with it is to make an argument for a way of thinking about this very utopian prospect, which I think, you know, maybe in the extreme form is not possible, but I think at least as a horizon is something that we should look to think of it as something in a sense that's not boring or that doesn't seem sort of unrealistically one-dimensional, to try to bring the conflict and the complication back in to that vision. And then from there, I go into this chapter 1, what I call socialism. And, you know, as people sometimes observe that the way I use these terms is sort of particular and doesn't always line up with the way they're used either in common discourse today or in the, or in the historical literature. I do think they broadly resemble the way these terms have been used like in the 19th and early 20th century, where communism is this sort of post-state, utopia, post money, post work, where basically we all have as much free time as we want, and nothing is really work in the sense of something we're forced to do to survive. It's what we choose to do in common. Whereas socialism requires some sort of a state, some sort of a government, some sort of representative process, probably, because in my version, where we're talking about a kind of eco-socialism, the big problem is not, like it was under something like Soviet socialism, deciding like what gets made and who does what jobs and how much they get paid and that sort of thing, because we have the machines taking care of that. But we still have to make decisions about like who is going to have to be, relocated because of rising sea levels, who is going to do whatever work needs to be done and can't be automated in the realm of like environmental cleanup. And most importantly, how do we decide and allocate who gets what in terms of, assuming we all have our replicators, who decides how, what's the sort of an equitable distribution of like how much stuff you can replicate. And so I talk again about some different science fiction, especially Kim Stanley Robinson is kind of one of the great eco-socialist science fiction writers, writes a lot about climate change, writes a lot about these kinds of futures in which people are coming together to try to figure out how to clean up the mess, basically, in a relatively egalitarian way. And then we have the sort of the other side, going back to the sort of like the more post-scarcity version, where we're not worried about the sort of ecological thing, right? We have rentism, which is the anti-Star Trek I described earlier, where everything is caught up in patents and, copyrights. And the problem there, of course, becomes where do people get money to pay for things if there's no jobs, because our workers aren't really needed to produce things. There's also the secondary question of, well, why would sort of capitalists want to keep accumulating money if money doesn't really mean all that much, if you can sort of replicate anything anyway? And the answer to that, I think, is that money is as much about power over others as it is about actually getting material stuff. Especially if you're a billionaire, having money, is not about being able to buy yet another super yacht. It's about the fact that you can exercise real political, social, cultural power by virtue of that money. And so to keep a system like that in place, whether or not it was materially necessary, is going to remain very important to the capitalist class, and intellectual property is one way they do that. I think in this category is also where you can categorize the meaning of certain capitalist and right-wing interest in the universal basic income as a policy. Basic income being, of course, the policy by which you can the government just gives everyone a payment, like pays out taxes progressively, taxes the rich, and then just gives everyone unconditionally a check, not tied to work or any requirement or anything. And on the left, this is often proposed as just sort of an egalitarian, redistributive measure that would be good for workers, and would be it would be good for workers and would redistribute wealth and would increase consumer power. But on the right, I think it can be seen as it's a way of propping up a system where they're recognizing there may not be enough jobs and therefore enough way of generating income that can be used to buy the stuff that enriches the capitalists. And so the basic income fills in the kind of the hole there. I want to make sure everyone can still hear me. I just heard a weird noise go off. You're still good? All right. I will.
It was a phone.
Okay, great. So yeah, and then finally you end up in this last box, which is the hierarchical and ecologically scarce world, which, if I return, hold on, to that, this is what I call exterminism. Exterminism was a term that originally comes from the Marxist historian E.P. Thompson. He wrote in the early 80s about the possibility of nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and used the term to describe that kind of situation. I'm using it for a different kind of situation, which is the one where the capitalist class has basically managed to automate away all the jobs. But because there's sort of limits to how much stuff we can make with the replicators to provide for people, there's this question of, like, from their point of view, there just being too many people. And if they want to continue to live their luxurious existence, hide away, move to higher ground, live in their gated communities or their private islands or whatever, they have to do something about this mass of people that are now superfluous. And that, you can see the inklings of that in contemporary struggles over mass incarceration, over the refugee crises in various parts of the world, where instead of the problem being figuring out how to exploit people, the problem ends up being how basically to control them and hide away from them and protect yourself from them with, you know, initially maybe your human guards, but eventually just your robot guards and your drones and whatnot. And the logic of a situation like that points in the direction of something that is frankly genocidal, in which it becomes easier to just kill off the poor rather than worry about them rising up and overthrowing you. And so obviously those are the tendencies that are some of the most dangerous that have to be combated the most urgently today, which in the end is the message of that book. And I think of most of what I write, that are all these lineages in the present leading off in various different good and bad directions, and which particular future, which particular mix of these different tendencies comes to fruition in the coming years is primarily going to be the result of the outcomes of our social and political struggles of the masses in motion. And so that my work is not an attempt to predict the future, rather it is an attempt to locate the possibilities that are latent in the present to better allow those of us who are participating, as I do and I hope you all are, in politics in the present, to give you tools for thinking about where it is you want to go and how it is that we might get there. So having said all that, I can come around to the actual topic of this and sort of try to connect this to the topic of this talk and the topic of the conference to which this is a contribution. And that is, of course, the phenomenon that is known as Jordan Peterson. Now, I'm not, you know, a Jordan Petersonologist, as I said, so I'm going to just try to identify one particular aspect of what his work taps into and how I think it sort of relates to how I think politically about finding meaning and finding a new future for ourselves and for, you know, the human race as a whole. So the recent Peterson self-help book that is a bestseller is called 12 Rules for Life is subtitled An Antidote to Chaos. And so it's easy to see why that promise of an antidote to chaos, a promise of order, would be appealing to a lot of people, and particularly to the young men who make up the bulk of Peterson's audience. Life is, of course, by its nature uncertain, but the uncertainty and precarity of life in contemporary capitalist society is particularly stark, and it impinges particularly on the young, who have many reasons to wonder what this future holds, or if they have a future at all. And I get this sometimes, even, you know, I'm 38 years old, and I talk to people 15, 20 years younger than me who have even sort of a bleaker sense of where they are and where things are going for them personally and for society as a whole. Malcolm Harris, in his book, Kids These Days, which I highly recommend, describes millennials as a generation born into what he calls a hyperventilating capitalism, in which they feel, quote, less in control over their lives than ever before. Now, Malcolm Harris is, like me, a Marxist, so he roots that lack of control in material factors. Like recent graduates have taken out far more student debt than earlier cohorts. So like student debt has tripled in the past 10 years, as I'm sure you guys know, or at least know anecdotally, but yet wages are remaining stagnant. And so even if graduates can find jobs, and we're told there's a very low unemployment rate, we're still facing wage growth that doesn't keep up with the debt people are incurring. And so, you know, people are never able to pay back their loans and are trapped under this debt forever. Now, meanwhile, there's this question of automation that I talk about in my work, where we hear story after story about these waves of automation that are going to come to take the jobs that exist. And then the flip side of that is that those jobs, the ones that are being automated away, are also a lot of them pretty bad jobs to begin with. So that the alternative to the self-driving cars that we don't have yet, or the totally robotized, you know, warehouses that we don't have yet, are the Uber drivers who, you know, often driving for Uber will average less than the minimum wage in some places for the amount of fares that they're able to get. Or the Amazon warehouse workers who work in like incredibly hot, difficult conditions and these just really stressful job. And even though the company has announced that at least some of its workers will now get up to a $15 minimum wage, it's still a horrible job, and that's still not enough for most people to live on. And the situation of precarity and uncertainty that I think people like Jordan Peterson respond to, it's a challenge to our ability to get by and to feed and house ourselves, as I just said. But for men especially, it's a challenge to identity. It's a challenge to our myths of what men are and should be. You know, we're raised to think still that we should be, you know, oftentimes providers and breadwinners for our women and our families, and men feel shame if they can't do that. That is, those of us who even want to partner with a woman or have a family or remain men for that matter. But the inability to live up to these norms can lead men to fear or blame women. And Harris observes something about this as well, that the stagnation of pay and expansion of debt has coincided with the increase in working women. And he warns that the past correlation between a larger share of GDP going to labor and women's low participation in the labor force has turned and will turn to causation in some minds. In other words, people look at a situation where they can't have what they imagine their fathers and grandfathers had in terms of a good, high-paying job that supports family, and they see that since that time, many more women have entered the workforce, and they sort of blame women for that or blame that situation and say want to go back to the time that they were in before. And so clearly the patriarchal aspect of somebody like Jordan Peterson's thought taps into those particular anxieties and that particular kind of anger. And the other part of this is that as the Me Too movement, among other things, has once again centered women's experience of abuse and harassment and put issues of consent and male accountability in the center of our conversations. Some men also are afraid of a chaos that they perceive in intimate relationships as well. And political leaders right now, right up to the president, are going around telling us that it's a very scary time for young men in America, to quote what Trump said recently, and that men are living in fear that, quote, they could be somebody that was perfect your entire life and somebody could accuse you of something, so it's this like mythology of this like torrent of false rape allegations or something like that. And so now that women are increasingly challenging the rules of society that allowed the behavior of men like Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh and the bad behavior of men in many other smaller ways, this new state of affairs can seem to some men like chaos. And into this whirlwind strolls confidently Jordan Peterson with his antidote to all this. And what's the antidote? Well, Peterson insists that, quoting from 12 Rules, people need ordering principles and that chaos otherwise beckons. We require rules, standards, values, alone and together. We're pack animals, beasts of burden. We must bear a load to justify our miserable existence. We require routine and tradition. That's order. That routine and tradition and orders, that's the core of what he's selling. And yes, there's the finding meaning in mythology and all this sort of stuff, but it's that routine and tradition and order. It's an answer, a set of 12 corny rules that will help you face this confusing and terrifying world. And the order he proposes is one that's crudely grounded in a kind of pop sociobiology that tells us that human societies must be ordered as wildly unequal hierarchies, that the choice I pose in my book is not in fact a choice, that we in fact have to be in these hierarchies in which we're always struggling for dominance because that's just how evolution is programmed us. He bases this, as many people like him do, on just some very kind of flimsy and contentious science that most actual natural scientists would dismiss. He applies this in particular to relations between men and women, of course, in which men must inevitably seek to assert dominance over each other and women will inevitably flock to the dominant male. And so he tells us that, quote, boys can only win by winning in the male hierarchy. They will lose status among girls and boys by being good at what girls value. And he presents this not as a historical and social fact that could be changed, but simply a fact about what is. So he'll bizarrely claim that because gender differences remain even in countries with fairly strong gender equality laws like Sweden, that those differences must be biological and they can't be cultural or they can't be historically constructed. But it's not biology. It's a particular environment of entitled macho impunity that creates men like Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh, and that creates just more low-level male shittiness. So Peterson, for example, has made some critical, although ambiguous, comments about Brett Kavanaugh himself. But Kavanaugh is really the perfect exemplar of the order that Peterson adores so much. By denying all accountability for an act of sexual assault and by blithely lying and condescending to Congress and still ascending to the lifetime court appointment that he believes is his right by virtue of his class and race and ideology, Kavanaugh affirms that male and ruling class dominance is the natural order and that no matter what you do, you can't change it. That's the message they want to send. But getting again back to the sort of basic orders that I'm trying to question, the other most important order that Peterson wants to preserve, aside from patriarchy, is that of the capitalist mode of production, which also cannot be truly called into question. That capitalist mode of production and its attendant political institutions must be naturalized, which is why one of his 12 rules is, quote, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And it's telling that he starts that chapter by talking about the school shooters at Sandy Hook and Columbine. He wants to set up for his readers this world in which the only alternative to his regimen of obsessive and individualistic self-perfection is the individualistic act of horrific murderous violence. There's no peaceful struggle. There's no collective struggle. And so he insists that if our careers are failing or we aren't getting along with our family or we're unlucky in love, we just need to look at ourselves and start acting more perfect. But whatever you do, and I quote, don't blame capitalism, the radical left, or the iniquity of your enemies. Don't reorganize the state until you have ordered your own experience. Have some humility. This is, of course, already contradictory, since Peterson himself blames the radical left for convincing people that they can change the world or change biologically fixed gender roles. But anyway, what this basically comes down to is that if you think your social conditions have even a slight bearing on your inability to achieve a perfect life, Peterson thinks you are prohibited from having any political or moral critique of society. You may not question your government or capitalism or the way men treat women. You may only question yourself. And of course, if we're never able to respect ourselves in the society that we live in, then that society must remain eternally. And so this is the trick that naturalizes capitalism. I, of course, reject this position completely, as the preceding talk, I think, should have made clear. And it's not, mind you, because I think we shouldn't be self-reflective and self-critical and get our own houses in order and try to act better, especially those of us who are men, and especially now. We all need to do that. But I think because Peterson's appeal to tradition blocks us from actually doing that, as well as barring the way to the project of actually changing the society that makes us feel so confused and chaotic in the first place. So rather than engage with Peterson's argument anymore, which is really just, when you come down to it, a familiar conservative Christian patriarchal boilerplate dressed up in rationalistic and mythologizing self-help language, I'd like to place Peterson in a broader context that repoliticizes what he attempts to depoliticize. And I want to do so by making use of yet another diagram, because I love my grid diagrams. So I'm going to use a device that I think is adequate to the intellectual level at which Jordan Peterson operates, and also one that many of his young followers will be familiar with. So in the spirit of discussing a figure of viral internet fame such as Jordan Peterson, I will present a critique in the form of a meme, which is a Dungeons and Dragons alignment chart. So, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the alignment system is a part of the role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons, which was introduced in the late 1970s. And it describes what the characters people play in the game are like based on two key attributes. One is their relationship to the society's rules that they live in, which may be a lawful one or a chaotic one of kind of breaking the rules and rejecting them. And then arrayed against that is the other axis, which is their relationship to their altruism or their respect for life, or contrarily their selfishness and their disrespect for others' lives, which is what makes them good or evil in this terminology. And so on each axis a character, and on each axis a character may also be neutral between the two, so producing a 3x3 grid of the possible alignments. Now this contrast between the lawful and the chaotic obviously directly relates to Peterson's obsession with order and chaos. But the good-evil axis defines, I think, the distinction between a commitment to an egalitarian society that ensures a decent life for all, and the kind of individualistic you're-on-your-own ethos that characterizes Peterson, and his insistence that we simply take responsibility for ourselves rather than questioning society. Now, it's naturally a bit contentious to apply the label good to one's own politics and evil to one's enemies. You know, it's very polarizing, obviously. It's meant to be. This whole thing is about polarizing. But I think it's actually better just to admit that this is what we all do. We believe what we believe because we believe that it's good, and oppose what we oppose because we think that it's evil. You know, and if someone on the right made this chart, of course, they just flip the good and the evil. And the problem is not, I think, in acknowledging that. The problem is that when we attribute the good or evil to people rather than to the actions of the ideology. So I think Jordan Peterson is aligned with evil insofar as the ideas he promotes are evil. But I don't think that he or certainly his fans are necessarily evil people. And on the contrary, I want to convert them from the dark side and win them to the forces of good. The law, the good and evil law and chaos framework can in a way be applied to the framework that I develop in Four Futures. So the equality hierarchy axis is implicitly the contrast between good and evil insofar as I'm an egalitarian and I want to challenge doctrines that attribute to the rich or to men or to any powerful elite some natural position of dominance. And that other axis between ecological scarcity and post-scarcity abundance is, you know, in a way, the one between the lawful and the chaotic. Insofar as we have to manage ecological limits and clean up environmental damage, we need a common social order, a law. And the question is whether it will be the egalitarian law of eco-socialist conservation or the hierarchical law of gated communities and desperate surplus population. Likewise, insofar as abundance gives rise to a cornucopian chaos of us all figuring out how to run Disneyland or do whatever, we upload our minds to the cloud or whatever, I think that can be the communist chaos in which we develop our talents and learn new ways to live with and take care of each other. Or it can be the rentist chaos in which brands, marketing, and intellectual property consume us in a postmodern consumer post-capitalism without limit, which is the sort of, I think, meaningless type of existence that in some ways drives people in the direction of people like Jordan Peterson, but also in the direction of the socialist left. Now, this all obviously in some ways makes the framework I'm using here very similar to another common meme, which is that political compass diagram in which ideologies are assigned to either the economic left or the economic right, and then to the libertarian or the authoritarian side of politics. And the examples I'm about to give are going to broadly correspond to the way that that compass is drawn, but I think that that way of putting it is not as helpful. Authoritarian and libertarian, of course, have historical associations that make it difficult for people to sort of process them in a fair way. And also, all sides tend to believe in a certain type of liberty, but not in other types of liberty. So the liberty to, be a landlord who discriminates against black people as against the liberty to not have to sell your labor to somebody else. What I think is a better way of thinking about it, and what I'm going to do with the alignment chart, is to think about the two axes, one of which has to do with this relationship to the current system, whether you want to either preserve the current system or push it in a more fascist direction, or whether you want to overcome the current system and push it in a more socialist direction. That's the evil good axis. And then the other one is sort of a relationship to where our politics are in historical time, what our relationship is to history and to the future. And there, what I want to say is that the emphasis, there's the emphasis on some traditional order, whether it's a capitalist one or a less capitalist one, emphasis on some model we get back to versus a chaotic openness to the unknown. The lawful is the politics of the once was, and the chaotic is the politics of the not yet. And by concluding the neutral squares, we can begin to understand some of the strange and sometimes disturbing intersections between these different kinds of politics. Which brings me finally to me and Jordan Peterson. Here we have my first swing at characterizing the kind of political alignment chart. And conveniently, Jordan Peterson stands down there in the lawful evil corner as far away as possible from the place I am, or at least try to be on my good days, the communist impulse of chaotic good, which was why that was the name of this talk, Chaotic Good, an Antidote to Jordan Peterson. And so to briefly explain why I put these things where I put them, lawful good, which I use Jeremy Corbyn, if you do not recognize him, is the leader of the British Labour Party. I could have put Bernie Sanders there as well, or certain kinds of left liberals would go here. These are, to me, lawful good means these are people who are not necessarily invested in preserving the current system, but they are in some ways nostalgic for some perceived heyday of the social democratic class compromise or of socialism. So this idea of like the New Deal order, where you had lots of high rates of unionization and high wages, and everybody shared in rising prosperity. Now, of course, for women, for people of color, for the global South, all of that was never really true. But the point is that it's this regulative ideal that's rooted in this kind of backwards-looking nostalgia. Whereas what I think of as that forward-looking chaotic good impulse is one that questions everything, questions capitalist property relations, questions the distribution of wealth, but also questions things that have not to as great an extent been questioned as much in the past, like relations between men and women, like the fluidity of gender identities, like the fact that race is not a thing that actually exists. It's simply the discursive effect of racist historical practices. So it's an openness to sort of like to breaking the rules and not knowing exactly where you're going, because that's the nature of a democratically unfolding political project. And that's the in between and neutral good is the logo of the Democratic Socialists of America, of which I'm a member, which sort of contains both of these tendencies and sort of tries to straddle them in certain ways. The logo on the right, the hammer and sickle, is actually the logo of the Red Bloom Communist Collective in New York, which I'm not a member of, but I am a big fan of, and who were very heavily involved in a lot of the actions against Brett Kavanaugh that were happening in the past week. So then you have down, the sort of the evil side. You have Jordan Peterson, lawful evil, and much like, he's, again, this is the way, as I said before, he's not that special or that new. He's very different in his mode of presentation, but you compare him to somebody like, Mike Pence or some other Christian conservative type. It's sort of the same deal. It's, you just need to act right and realize that this is just the way it is. Capitalism and patriarchy are facts of nature, and you're just going to be miserable if you don't accept that. And if you do accept it, you still may be miserable, but it's your own fault. Whereas the sort of on the right, the kind of 4chan troll, Pepe the Frog, make America great again, the type of like right-wing meme culture and alt-right culture and certain types of neo-fascism that are heavily invested in irrationalism. are the kind of chaos, or kind of a chaotic evil, which I think on some level Jordan Peterson probably thinks he's like saving people from, or sort of winning people from, in favor of his kind of rigid self-discipline. And then of course in the middle you have people like Mitch McConnell, who will happily make deals with either of these sides as long as they, you know, as long as maybe they get to do evil. And so true neutral, of course, is centrist Clintonian Democrats who have no true principles and just kind of flail around trying to get people to like them. Lawful neutral there is again a sort of a phenomenon. That's a picture of Joseph Stalin. It says, you know, a communist Stalinist march. I'm particularly thinking here of certain kinds of the new phenomenon of kind of neo-Stalinism online, or tankies, sometimes people call them, which is a reference to back in 1956 when people split with the Communist Party over the Soviet invasion of Hungary. But anyway, there's a lot of these sort of flagrantly, you know, authoritarian new socialists who also kind of support regimes like North Korea or Assad's Syria. You know, they're these very sort of, they're also very backward looking and very sort of think in sort of hierarchical terms. But I also would lump in here stuff like the exclusionary radical feminists, the types who basically deny the reality of trans people, or that trans women are women, or that people should be able to affirm their chosen gender identity, or the people who are, you know, who are kind of also come from out of the lawful good side, who think that it's all these SJWs and people caring too much about race and gender that's driving away the quote unquote normal workers, who they are always, of course, sort of implicitly perceive as these straight white males that would just support socialist economics if we could get all this other identity politics stuff out of there, which then leads them in the direction of this place in between the sort of old school socialist position and the actually just socially conservative position. And then finally, maybe the one people will be less familiar with, the example I chose for chaotic neutral is sort of the left-wing versions of accelerationism. For those who don't inhabit certain parts of academia or online left spaces, this is an idea that comes out of some 90s cultural studies stuff, but it's had sort of a resurgence on the left. Excuse me. There's the recent book Inventing the Future by Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, which is often associated with the idea, which is basically that in order to get to the kind of communist Star Trek future that I laid out earlier, we need to sort of accelerate capitalism, in the sense that we need to accelerate its drive to automate everything in order to save money, so that we can create the material preconditions for that communist future. And this has its roots in certain, you know, old Marxist ideas about the forces of production having to mature to a point where it's materially possible to have an abundant socialist or communist future, rather than just kind of socializing misery and poverty. But in certain forms, this accelerationism is sort of ambivalent between the kind of chaotic good communist impulse to try to take a leap into the unknown and, you know, question everything, and the sort of nihilistic desire to just sort of let capitalism drive its logic deeper and deeper and become more and more inhuman, which you see in the philosopher who coined the term originally, Nick Land, who started off sort of on the left, but now is associated with the alt-right, with what's called neo-reaction or the intellectual dark web or what have you, and has become very much just sort of racist, misogynist, extremely pro-capitalist, sort of anti-human kind of thinker. So that's where that line is drawn. And I've already been going longer than I intended to, and I don't have a really neat ending here other than the hope that this way of thinking about things provides some insight both into what the Jordan Peterson phenomenon really is, what is at stake, and what sort of some of the ways out are, and or the alternative stories that we can tell are for those of us who, you know, either want an antidote to chaos, or maybe think, as I think I do, that the left, to be truly emancipatory and liberatory and democratic, is the party of chaos. And that a certain type of chaos is what we should have the courage to embrace. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. I don't know if we're doing.
Thank you for gracing us with your with this debut of your new diagram. It was,
I'm becoming, I don't know, I'm just sort of leaning in, I'm just leaning into the shtick. That's this to be my gimmick now, I guess.
It works. It works.
No, it works really well, actually.
Good. It'll hopefully appear in writing, or at least in meme form in the future.
Awesome. Well, I guess we could take a few minutes to take some questions, but we'll basically have this wrapped down in the next like 5 minutes. So, anybody have any thoughts or insights or criticisms? Anyone want to criticize? No, I'm just kidding.
Hey,
Well, kudos to whoever designed your cover.
What was that?
Kudos to whoever designed your cover. It's a beautifully designed bit of graphic
yes.
art.
Thank you. It's it was designed by, I think Aaron Schell was the designer on that. It was one of the advantages I've had of being connected with Jacobin Magazine since its beginning, and of that book being in a series that was done between Verso and Jacobin, is that I had access to Jacobin's very excellent graphic design and art people.
Great. So maybe you could just go a little bit further into how this graph ties into that more traditional authoritarian, libertarian, left-right economic. Is it just that the D&D version has these extra pieces that?
I mean, the neutral is partly, I think, helpful in sort of looking at. It helps you see the interplay rather than just seeing them as opposed. I also think that, as I was sort of trying to draw out, that in the political compass version with authoritarian, libertarian, and left-right on economics, it's sort of a static thing. It's just this is what people believe, is good in politics or is important in politics. And I was trying to, in one of my axes there, I was trying to give it sort of and in both of them in a way, the sort of temporal and historical dimensions of what is it that we're looking to what is our vision, in the sense it's not just because the political compass can make it seem like we all just have different blueprints in our head for what society should be like. What I was suggesting is that's really only true on one side, whether the blueprint is the Soviet Union or anarcho-capitalism or whatever we classify Jordan Peterson's particular form of kind of conservative patriarchal capitalism as. Whereas the other side, the side I'm talking about, is actually open to the radical uncertainty of the future, of the kind that I was sort of trying to get at in my book, of the future, which is like, its broad outlines and tendencies can be seen, but can't be predicted in advance, and shouldn't be predicted in advance, because the construction of that future should be the task of something that's democratically arrived at by the people that undertake to build it. And in a way that's in a way goes beyond this sort of libertarianism aspect of, some kind of, which tends to get you back into talking about individual freedom and stuff like that. It really is this sort of openness to uncertainty and the unknown, whether that's in the form of, are those factions of the socialist and communist movement that will radically question the nature of, sex and gender and other kind of identity categories, will assist that what we want is not merely for the workers to be in power, but for the very concept of worker to no longer have any meaning, because we no longer live in a world of alienated labor. But it picks up in those other categories, like the accelerationist idea of just driving capitalism, full speed ahead and see where it gets us, or that what I think drives sort of the nihilism of some of the like right-wing 4chan-y kind of meme culture, which is just the kind of getting people riled up and creating chaos and creating strong reactions just for the sake of it, with no real instinct other than to burn it all down. This is one of the things when I talk about Trump particularly, and how to understand him as a phenomenon, and of candidates like him, is that most of his coalition is the traditional Republican coalition, right? It's like bosses, assholes, racists. But then there's a category of voter that I call the D's nuts voter. And if you recall, during the primary season, there was this kid, and I want to say it was North Carolina or something, who got onto a primary ballot under the name D's Nuts, which is a reference to a very profane gangster rap song from the 90s, if you don't know. And they got national coverage of this like D's Nuts on the ballot. And like, there was a part of the base for Trump and also for other kind of outsider populist candidates, which is basically the people that want to vote for D's Nuts, because they just want to burn it all down. And I think you have to understand that kind of aspect of like chaotic evil in our political life.
I think most of us voted for D's Nuts, and I have to apologize. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, there's a D's Nuts component to the Bernie Sanders vote too.
Yeah.
Trump is a monster from the id. Just that sheer capacity and desire for destruction.
I mean, it's really you're just saying it's the fuck you voter, the person who voted for this is the burn it down person, right?
Yeah, that everything is fucked, and how could it get worse? So I might as well just throw a wrench in the system and see what happens.
Yeah, which was, I think, sort of Zizek's stance, right? It was kind of that coupled with a sort of accelerationism.
Right. Yeah, and I think, but yeah, in this case, I think there's some of that, but I think it really is. And again, this is a very small proportion of Trump's base, which by and large is a standard, Republican coalition of evangelicals and white supremacists and rich people. But that to the extent that something is different about Trump, it does a lot of it come from the D's nuts vote. And that is a group to which we can appeal to from the left, but which somebody like Jordan Peterson also appeals to from the right in terms of giving sources of hope and meaning and the possibility of a different world. Anybody else?
I wanted to step back and not insert myself. But yeah, I think that's great, and that we're all satiated, and that this has been a lot of really exciting, stimulating, inspiring, edifying information. So thank you for that presentation.
Great, thanks a lot for having me. This was fun to do. And sorry I won't be able to join you out in Idaho, but good luck with the conference, and yeah, hope it's a great time.
We hope to have you for something in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And preferably one of two of these futures, not.
Yes, right. Well, I guess in the Star Trek future, they also have transporters, right? So that would make it easier to get out there.
Oh, wow.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.